Welcome to the Contrarian Boston Forum on the Bay State Energy Crisis. I'm Jen Powell, your producer, and I want to encourage you, if you have not already, to subscribe to Contrarian Boston, the region's best source for independent news. And please share that with your colleagues. And with that, I will turn it over to Scott Van Voorhis, our editor-in-chief.
Thanks, Jen. We're here with some great panelists here to hash out the issues related to the Bay State energy crisis. Here with Paul Levy, former chair of the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities. So there's a kind of inside look at how some of this stuff works. And Mike Monahan, vice president for the second district for the IBEW. And potentially joined a little later by Senator Mike Barrett, chair of the legislature's energy committee. So to kick things off, wanted to get into the costs that consumers are seeing and on their electric bills. It's there's certainly a kind of was a big uproar over it earlier this year. The governor decided to pare back some of the charges in the Mass Save program. I guess the question is does that go far enough? And is there an issue with how this is being paid for that may not be sustainable in the long term in terms of people weren't noticing these charges for a long time. They were just, they weren't big enough, but now they're getting big. The costs are rising. And is it a case where the legislature just needs to step in and debate it and decide, okay, if this is important, crucial, then we need to pay for it that way. Anybody want to jump in on that?
Mike, you want to start?
No, Paul, I think that's really in your wheelhouse from your past. I have an opinion, but you have actually data, I'm sure, to back that up.
Thank you. First, Scott, thanks for having us. Mike, it's so great to be with you. And Jen, you're absolutely right in the way you characterize Contrarian Boston. It is, if you're not reading it, you should be, because it's where it's happening. A little personal background. First, I have to say, although I'm chair of the board of Charles River Watershed Association, I'm not appearing here on behalf of Charles River Watershed Association, which is focused mainly, as its name implies, on the Charles River and protecting that watershed and also dealing with some of the impacts of climate change in the watershed. My personal background here goes back to the 1970s when I first went to work for a guy named Henry Lee under Governor Sargent in the State Energy Office, and then Mike Dukakis shortly thereafter that, and then he appointed me to the DPU in the 70s, and then he lost, and then Governor Clinton appointed me to be Secretary of Energy in Arkansas, and then I came back and worked for Governor Dukakis again at the DPU. And so I've got a long view of this, and it's, I have to say, it's not a pretty view, Scott. I mean, the issues we're seeing today are not all that new, and it's New England and Massachusetts have always had this problem of being, quote, at the end of the pipeline when it comes to fossil fuels, and also somewhat isolated with regard to its electricity grid. Although there are connections to other regions, there are limits to those connections. So it's hard to optimize for all of New England. And over the years, we've all tried to deal with this, whether at the DPU level or at ISO New England, which supervises the grid, or the New England governors or the state legislature. As I look back on it, I have to say, and I was part of this often, there was a lot of wishful thinking. There were a lot of decisions that were made in terms of energy policy saying, well, we know we've got to go in this direction, the market's not going to respond, so we're going to add these additional costs to people's electricity bills. When I first started, we were adding costs for energy conservation programs. 7 or 8 years ago, we added billions of dollars in costs for solar energy credits, thinking that would help in the long run. Before that, you had electric utilities convinced that building big nuclear power plants was the way to go. And there was actually a plan in the 70s to add 8 or so 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plants that would have mortgaged the region up the hilt. Thankfully, that didn't happen. What's disturbed me, which gets to the heart of your question, is in the last 10 or 15 years, I think decisions have been made based on more on ideology than on the physics of the electric power grid, and more and on the laws of economics, both of which are pretty sound.
Sure.
And with good intentions. But when you spend $10 billion for solar tax credits or energy credits that get added to electric power bills, and you've bought an intermittent power source that isn't available when you need it all the time, then you have to have something backing that up. And then the something that backs it up, for the most part, has to be gas-fired units. But then if you have a limitation on pipeline capacity into the region, you're paying the world price for natural gas. And so when you have a cold winter like we just have, it adds billions of dollars to our costs. I realize I'm not giving any solutions right now, but I thought it might be helpful just to give that
No, that's fascinating.
And Mike, I don't know if you want to jump in on that stuff too, but
Yeah, and also, Mike, I mean, I think you're probably right in your wheelhouse. I mean, that's such a big issue that it's been starting to get debated. Should we be adding another gas pipeline? Would that bring down costs? And then you have the pushback of people saying, well, look, that's not going to solve the long-term problem of, carbon emissions.
Yeah, I tend to look at things a little simple, right? It's economics 101, supply and demand, I think applies to most things that cost anything. My background is I'm an electrician by trade, and a member of Local 103, kind of ran things there for about 20 years. Like Paul said, I met you, Paul, over on that 9.5-mile tunnel I was working on at Deer Island, and, the outfall tunnel. But certainly, I think the social costs or whatever those added costs to our electric bill should be taken out entirely. And it should be paid for by the legislature passing bills and so on and so forth, not hidden inside these bills. They're tough enough to read, never mind all these add-ons. But, I'm with you 100%, Paul, on solar. We install them. We like the work. But as far as, industry goes, they're not reliable. There's only about 15 to 20% capacity. And it's dark a lot, and and there's clouds around a lot, and so I don't think that's the answer to power our economy. Gas, nuclear. It really, if you want to power the economy. What frustrates me, Paul, which this is a compliment to you, we in my opinion do not have any big thinkers in Massachusetts State House or our people that represent us in Washington. There are no big thinkers for Central Artery stuff, Deer Island stuff. And they're just kind of with their finger in the air, and whatever 18 to 22-year-old kids think is how they're governing. And rather than being the adult and saying, why aren't we getting any data centers? The data centers are going up everywhere in this country. Why aren't we getting chip plants? There's not a single data center under construction. We don't have a single chip plant. And when it came to any of the IRA money or the infrastructure money, we didn't get any of it. And that's because our elected officials are too focused in other areas that don't provide jobs. There's no manufacturers looking to come here. I understand how they left years ago. Things were highly with people, right? A lot of people. Today it's so automated. There's less people, but the cost of electricity and the political climate in this area of the country is a little crazy, in my opinion. So it's affecting construction, which is where I come from, and in manufacturing, where the IBEW represents people at Raytheon, represents people that make wire and fixtures and stuff like that, and they're leaving, and not just overseas, but they're leaving because of the climate here and the cost of electricity, and nobody seems to be addressing it.
Really interesting points there. And wondering, one of the things I'm wondering is, we're talking about, you need kind of you have the intermittent power sources, solar, So you need something, and I guess offshore wind to some extent, but you need, a fallback. You need, either gas-fired plants or some way, some or nuclear plants that are providing reliable power. Um, and I'm wondering, have we put too many of our eggs, or Massachusetts put too many of its eggs in the offshore wind basket? And is it at this point even realistic to expect more than one of these facilities to be open in the next 5 or 10 years? I know there's the one that has opened. It's got one turbine working. They had issues. They had to replace a lot of the blades. It's been a slow process. But are we banking too much on offshore wind? It's because sort of coming in and solving some of the problems here.
I think so.
But I think I think it's a really good question. And as I go back over my 50-year history in this field, I think the general problem we've faced in Massachusetts and New England is we've failed to understand the importance of a diversified energy portfolio that has a mix of fossil and nuclear and wind and the rest. And the reason you need diversification in supplies is because the energy business is inherently uncertain. You just never know what's going to be coming around the corner. So take wind. Wind has tremendous potential. Unlike solar, which has a pretty low capacity factor, as Mike was suggesting, offshore wind turbines could have capacity factors of 55% or so, which is pretty good. And I think we had something like 8 gigawatts of wind I keep using the word in the pipeline. It's not in the pipeline, but on the books. But then the wind the wind business hit again some turbulence along the way. The international wind world hit troubles. There were COVID supply chain related problems. There were things like that. This is even before President Trump was withdrawing offshore permits. We didn't have enough in New England. We didn't have enough local onshore wind infrastructure to support what we said we were going to build. But it was almost like we had a religious belief that it would show up. And in the past, we had a religious belief that nuclear power was going to solve the problem, or that small hydro was going to solve the problem. It's like every 10 years we come up with our latest ideological conclusion, and we forget. It's funny, when I was in Arkansas, there was a state legislator who was talking to me one day, and he said, this pi being equal to 3.14159, that's too complicated. I want to file a bill making pi equal to 3, because that would just make life a lot easier. And it feels like in New England, we do that in the energy world. We look at a simple solution. We say, okay, we're going to reduce carbon emissions by X. Well, where does X come from?
Exactly.
And then we don't relate what that target means to the actual physics of running the transmission system, running the local distribution system. We have to get back to the local distribution system because there's a lot of hope for what's going to happen there. We have to look at what batteries really can and cannot offer in the way of storage that covers shortfalls. And as Mike was suggesting, we also don't look at the laws of economics. We don't look at supply and demand. So if we have great hopes, for example, for electric vehicle sales in the region, and if we have great hopes for heat pumps substituting for other heating and cooling systems, but if our price of electricity is so high that those uses become uncompetitive, then the sad irony is we're actually undercutting the climate goals by the policies we've adopted. And I'm not saying throw them all out,
Right.
but I'm just saying let's keep in mind that as we used to say about gravity, it's not just a good idea, it's the law. The laws of physics are the laws of physics. The laws of economics hold all the time. And we need to meld those into the climate goals we have so that we have a sustainable result. And as Mike was also suggesting, if we think we're going to rely on other regions, guess where those data centers are being built right now in other regions? And that's stopping up the capacity that they might otherwise be able to share with us. So we find ourselves in an ever less competitive situation, which is just not good for a region that could otherwise be so vibrant.
Yeah, no, great, really great points. And I wonder also, there's a misconception about kind of the economic growth and the economy, and when in terms of the energy transition, the idea that we just need to take what we have now and switch out and have all these decarbonized sources, and that's fine, without taking into account that demand is so it looks like it's going to be growing exponentially, right? You got AI, for these data centers. If they're not coming here, they're coming somewhere, right? And they're going to be requiring more power. And the modern economy seems to be moving in that direction, just more demands on power. So it's not just a question of switching out what you have now, but also accounting for the growth that you're going to be having. That seems to be picking up and becoming more intensive. So segue into nuclear power. Is it time to look back again? I guess it's the carousel is back to nuclear power, but is it time to look at that again? And how do we, I mean, I think I ask, why wouldn't we do that? But on the other hand, in a state where you build an apartment building and people are freaked out, I mean, I can only imagine they're going to freak out about, it's just a small nuclear reactor, a small modular reactor. It's not a big deal. How would you get that done? But do we need to start looking at that, and where would we start?
Well, first thing you have to do is support what the governor is proposing, and that's not have a ballot question to have nuclear, right? So yesterday, there's still people that are against removing that. They want to vote on it, and it just won't work. Like I said, the people in Washington that put their finger up in the air, they're not going to support nuclear for Massachusetts. But the term you were looking for, Scott, is baseload power, right? So they call baseload power as gas, oil, coal, nuke. That's there all the time. And solar and wind and all the other stuff is intermittent. But we use about 120 to 130 tera hours of electricity a year in New England. And this is where I wish elected officials would become adults, and if they are that ignorant, then shame on them. 5% of that 125 is wind and solar. You are not going to power the New England economy or Massachusetts off of solar panels. I mean, just stop it, right? It's an all of the above solution, and nuclear and gas have to be part of it. We've closed 3 nuclear power plants in New England, Vermont Yankee, Maine Yankee, and Pilgrim. All 3 states saw their carbon footprint increase when they closed the nukes. We're closed Everett. People want District Gas, whatever the name of it is now, to close. They're just not practical people, and the press doesn't push back on them other than yourself. And it's just, show me these politicians 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 100% carbon free by 20 this. It's like people are listening to them and saying, back that up. Nobody's asking them to back it up. And
Yes.
so it's just infuriating. But gas is not going anywhere unless we don't want any electricity. So
Yeah,
nuclear is cleaner. SMRs are not going to be here next year. And so this is going to continue to fester. And as demand increases, generation decreases, and we put more of our electricity onto these wind and solars, which is intermittent. And it's just anybody with brains should be able to see what's coming our way.
Yeah.
And if I could just follow up on Mike's point, for the last many years now, there's been a very strong objection to increasing the supply of natural gas in the region. And likewise, there have been local actions, including in my own hometown of Newton, to prohibit new gas hookups for new buildings or for major renovations. And there's even talk now of, over time, requiring people to disconnect the gas services they have in their existing buildings. with the premise that the substitute for that will be electricity, and with the further premise that that electricity will be produced by non-carbon producing sources of power. And while that may be the case over the long run, between now and the long run, we actually have to deal with what's real. And because transmission lines from New York have been blocked, we are buying natural gas on the international market. And when there's a cold winter or a price spike, we pay a lot more. Like this last winter, I think it was $2.5 billion extra. Now, my personal view of this is I believe that there does have to be a transition, but I think it has to be a sensible one over a sensible time period, and that we have to balance current needs, current costs, competitiveness of the region with the longer term goals. For example, when the solar credits were at their peak a few years ago, in addition to the RECs that were being provided, homeowners who had solar cells on their house were able to run the meter backwards. In other words, they would get credit for the entire cost of a kilowatt hour because they were producing a solar kilowatt hour. Well, the problem with that is that they were not actually saving the grid any money on the distribution portion of the system. So if you were giving people a credit of so many cents per kilowatt hour for their solar production, and they weren't saving money for the rest of the system, it meant that other people, the ones who didn't have the solar cells, in essence, were subsidizing the people with the solar cells. Now, I mean, we have subsidies throughout society, but I would guess that if you looked at which people in the region were getting solar cells, it would be the wealthier folks, and which people were paying for those subsidies, it would be the less wealthy people.
Sure.
So I think we should be looking at issues like that, those income distributional issues, in addition to the issue of competitiveness in the region. I'm starting to see Senator Barrett there.
Yeah,
Long
hi,
time
Senator
no see,
Barrett.
Mike.
Thanks
This
for
is like a
good to see
reunion
you.
for several
Yeah.
of us here.
Hey, Paul.
Yeah.
Hi. Great to see you.
Yeah. So we're
Have
here
that same-
with Senator Mike Barrett, Senate Chair of the Legislature's Energy Committee, and we kind of got rolling here with a couple of the questions related to having a good discussion here related to.
Scott, we're going to make this exciting because due to the press of meetings, I was not able to examine any questions. I'm going to be in genuine podcaster mindset, talking off the top of my head without
There we
any
go.
idea of
Just
what
let
I'm
it
saying.
roll. Yeah, well, that'll be good. That makes it for better viewing. Yes. One thing we talked about, and maybe you're in a position to jump in on, is the kind of the backlash over electric bill charges that people started for many years. There have been charges related to renewable energy, the transition, that people just weren't paying a lot of attention to. Looking at your electric bill is pretty boring, right? I mean, it's hard to figure out what is this, whatever. It's $2. Now it's a significant amount of money. There's been a backlash over it. So two things. One is, are we hitting the point where it's no longer a kind of a politically sustainable way of financing these programs to actually have it on the bill and just ask ratepayers to pick it up? And two, is this something the legislature should, or even would be able to take up as an issue and say, look, this is what the cost is. These are realistically what we're going to be paying, or every year, and we're going to bond it or pay through it for tax money, or who knows. Certainly, probably not the federal government. But are we? How much longer can we continue with the current system of charges on people's electric bills?
Well, politically, it's very hot. isn't it? And not without good justification. People are feeling the pain. Part of the pain has to do with the contrast with what they remember from bills in years past. So you've got a situation where you had a very cold February, as we know, and people contrast it intuitively with what they're used to and can't believe how much it rocketed up. But as you all know, because you're and as many of our listeners will know, there are all kinds of ways to think about numbers, and we need to conjure with all of them. The real bill, what I pay out of pocket, is undeniably, and it hurts. Still, there are other sets of numbers out there, and we need to engage with those too. I happen to have done taken a look at the website of the U.S. Energy Information Administration recently, because yesterday we had a hearing on the governor's energy affordability bill, as you know, Scott. And by the way, thank you for this podcast. It's extremely well timed. If you go on this website and you can take a look, as I did, almost by happenstance, at table E15, which is searchable if you fool around with your cursor, and you get some. So there are different ways of thinking about this. We are fifth most expensive in the United States in terms of combined costs of gas and electricity for the last year for which we have full data, which is 2022. We're a pricey place, and that's per unit cost, which is the only thing people talk about. How much am I paying per kilowatt? How much am I paying per therm? But you could also ask the question, as statisticians do, and it's a legit question too, what's the energy expenditure per capita? So it costs a lot per unit, but how many units am I using? Well, it turns out in Florida, they use a whole bunch of units because the place is so darn hot so much of the year, chewing up electrons to stay cool. We don't do that, obviously, in New England. In some ways, although we don't want to give ourselves too much credit because there are problems to be solved, we're in an opportune place in the US as climate change hits us. We are a cooler part of the country than most of the United States is. We consume many fewer kilowatt hours, Scott. So while the cost per unit is sky high, it's fifth most expensive, the number of units we're consuming today, notwithstanding the incredible heat of the last 3 days, is very small compared to the rest of the country. What the U.S. Information Agency tells us, administration tells us, and they have no reason to fib, is that we are 35th most expensive per capita. We consume many fewer units of electricity and gas combined, even though each of those units is very, very expensive. So both things are true, right? We're paying a whole bunch per kilowatt, but we're not consuming as many kilowatts as the Sun Belt and as other even colder parts of the states do in the winter. And there's another way of thinking about it. I don't like to think about it this way because I don't want to be accused of being an elitist pig. But you could take a look at the state GDP. We are a state that actually has a healthy economy and has had one for the last 10 years. As a proportion of the state GDP, what we're paying for energy is tiny. Who knew? We're 48th out of 50 states in terms of the energy cost as a proportion of the economy. So we're not, and then there's yet one more cut on this, and I'm only stating this because I'm going to display something here. This happens to be the every 2 weeks publication put out by the country's DPU commissioners. Again, a pretty objective source. You asked the question because statisticians do ask this question. Where are we in terms of, and this happens to be residential energy costs as a proportion of total household expenditures? Now, that's an important nitty-gritty question. That's not a question just for elitist pigs. As a matter of household income, how much am I paying for electricity and gas combined? According to the publication of the commissioners across the country who regulate gas and electric rates, we paid in 2023, that was the reference year for which they had 1.56% of total average household income. 1 less than 2%. You say to yourself, that cannot be right. Given the outrage that people feel, and that given what I hear from my constituents, it cannot be that total combined gas and electric costs are less than 2% of household income for the typical Massachusetts family. And yet that's what the data seem to suggest. I don't want to suggest that these numbers are the final word. To me, they raise questions. They don't resolve them. But the questions being raised here is whether the media and even policymakers perhaps have focused so much on the sky-high cost per kilowatt hour that we failed to give ourselves some credit. Because here's the hidden success story that might be buried in these numbers. Mass Save and other programs like it really have made Massachusetts apartments and condos and houses energy tight since 2008 when Mass Save started. It could be that we're not only a cooler part of the US, consuming fewer electrons because we don't have to run air conditioning 8 months out of the year. It could also be that these energy efficiency programs, which we're feeling a little angry about, have over time, because all of us have had Mass Save at one point or another, have made our housing pretty energy tight. Maybe that's the reason we don't consume a lot of kilowatt hours relative to the rest of the country. The long and the short of it is that we're going from, as I say, and I'll conclude with this, 5th most expensive in terms of cost per unit of energy, but 35th most expensive, with most of the country more expensive than us, 35th most expensive when you correct for the amount of energy units we use to stay cool or warm. How do you figure that? Because I can't quite come to terms with it myself.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, those are really interesting numbers. I also wonder whether, putting those numbers in context, that as you're doing is interesting, but also putting in the larger context that everything is so expensive here, right? Like, it's not just the electric bill, but you're dealing with high rents, high mortgages, high healthcare, high childcare, high local taxes. So for a lot of people, this was something that maybe it's like the straw that, broke the camel's back. It's like, yeah, I mean, I can barely make a go as it is now. And now this is, increasing by 10%, 20%. So I wonder whether, it's sort
It's
of
a good point. You're raising an interesting question. But as a policymaker, I can't deny these numbers. I can't pretend that they don't exist. I have to assume for the moment that they're correct, and that I need to take that into account. And I don't want to overreact. I both want to provide people relief without throwing out the baby, as well as the bathwater. I don't want to destroy climate policy because we assume mistakenly, as it might turn out, that it's too expensive. It could be that, now let me just say one more thing about Mass Save, just make a simple point. Mass Save saves people money. It doesn't cost people money. The reason we reduced spending on Mass Save in March is because this is not a moment where people want to invest for the long term. They were hurting in February. They said, hey, most of the time, my rational brain says, of course, I want to reduce my overall spend over time. And so I'll invest in these energy efficiency measures so that I use less kilowatt hours to keep my house lit. But today, because of this cold winter, man, I need short-term relief, and it's real. So what we did in reducing spending on Mass Save wasn't to say that Mass Save costs more than it saves. Quite the contrary, it actually saves more than it costs. But the savings are accrue over time, and right now we can't afford to be long-term thinkers. That's okay too. There are times when short-term thinking has to rule, but let's not forget that investments in making your house energy tight, when you can make those investments, will save you money over the course of fill in the blank. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. The long term still deserves a lot of respect, even as the short term demands its share of our thoughts too.
Sure. looks like Mike had some, I wanted to jump in here.
Couple of things, Scott. The senator has some valid points there, but most people don't have a medium income of the residents of his district. Okay, certainly members of my local union do not live in Senator Barrett's district. So,
Hey, Mike, these are
Yeah.
not numbers for my district, right? So let's
For the
not
state-
elect
for the
straw
state.
horses.
for the state, but it's not as big of an issue for your constituents as it is for other people. Secondly, a data center, it doesn't matter where it's located, uses the same amount of electrons. A chip plant, doesn't matter where it's located, uses the same amount of electrons. And these people are making choices based on New England, having the 6 New England states are in the top 10 for the most expensive electricity in the United States of America. And it's affecting my members. It's affecting people that work in plants and manufacturing facilities and so on and so forth. We don't have a single data center under construction. We don't have a single chip plant under construction because of the cost of electricity and because of the political climate of this area, New England, I'm speaking, not just Massachusetts. So I hear you on the residential piece, those are voters. But when it comes to developing factories and developing where people go to work, it's not happening. It's not happening. And they pay taxes also.
Yeah, well, Mike's right. And certainly the manufacturing piece isn't happening, but the manufacturing piece hasn't been happening for 50 years. You know, my grandfather had a textile factory in Worcester, Massachusetts. As a kid, he used to make Altaboy castics and priest uniforms. He made clerical garb. That was the Toomey family company's specialty. And he, Mike, to your point, we were making the clothing in Massachusetts.
Yeah, but let's.
But that was the 1950s. No, it's but it has, Michael, it has been happening, Mike. It has been happening for it has been happening for 70 years. This is not a 10-year phenomenon. It's not a 20-year phenomenon. We've been losing jobs in textiles to the Sun Belt and then overseas for your entire lifetime.
Yes,
So
I know. We
again,
used to make
let's,
shoes in Brockton, but
Hey,
AI.
Paul, do you want to jump in?
AI is new, and data and chip plants are fairly new. We're not doing it.
So, yes, I'd like to jump in. Thanks, Senator Barrett. It's great to see you again.
Good to see you, Paul.
A couple of things. One is, I think Mike Monahan makes a good point, which is that just because there have been previous trends in industrialization that have left out New England doesn't necessarily mean we want that to be the case going forward. And just as we've become a center for biotech and stuff like that, that's less energy intensive, we've basically, it's just not feasible for a number of those other kinds of industries to move here, given the cost structure that they would see. Now, if as a matter of state policy, we say, well, we don't care about that, then that's one thing. But if as a matter of state policy, we might want to attract them, then we have to think slightly differently about the electric power side of things. But Scott, I wanted to, looking to the future, I also wanted to bring up another issue because I think this gets to the question of who and how things should be paid for. If as a number of policymakers currently believe, there should be greater electrification at the local distribution level, that is to say, in people's homes and businesses. And if there's a desire to push more electric vehicles that would plug into people's homes, sockets in their homes, and if there's a desire for more heat pumps that will require different voltages to operate on in the local distribution system, it's going to be Mike's members who are going to do the electrical work that will make that possible. But there's an open question as to how it should be paid for, because the local distribution is not currently equipped. It's not ready for that transition. Now, traditionally, we would have the local electric utilities build that kind of infrastructure, and we would build into the electric rates that people pay the cost of those upgrades. They would earn a return on those upgrades, and if we do that, the price of electricity will go up to pay for those improvements. Now, there's a really interesting question, since this is basic infrastructure, whether that should be financed in that way, in the traditional way through electric utility rates, or whether as a matter of economic development and climate policy, it's so important to the Commonwealth that it should be funded through general tax revenues, through, for example, bonding, that kind of infrastructure, the same way we would bond highways or broad internet service to underserved areas. And it seems to me, I don't have the answer to which is the better way to do that, but it seems to me that that's a question that's really worth thinking about. Because if we do it the traditional way, the problem that Mike Monahan has been talking about will grow, which is to say we will add cost to the retail cost of electricity, whether it's residential, commercial, or industrial. Whereas if we do it through tax revenues, now after a while the taxpayers and the ratepayers start to look like the same people, but there might be some advantages using, for example, tax-exempt financing to pay for those kinds of infrastructure improvements, which might therefore result in a lower overall cost to the citizens of the Commonwealth. So I just wanted to throw that out as a kind of a brainstorming topic to think about, because it seems to me it's worth thinking about. You know, when I was running the MWRA and we were building the Deer Island plant, or I should put it this way, when Mike and his members were building the Deer Island plant, and Senator Barrett and I were working on raising people's water bills to pay things, the same issue came up. How much of this should be paid in people's utility bills versus in general tax revenues, if there's a public good that we're trying to achieve? In that case,
you raise a very good point. And here's the interesting news. Yesterday in this hearing on governor's affordability bill, a lot of the questions rotated around exactly what you're talking about. So you may well have been the inspiration for this idea, but in the governor's language right now, and Mike should feel good about this. She proposes that the legislature permit the securitization of energy infrastructure in the new way that you're suggesting. And I'm sure, well, sureness, being sure is a risky business these days. I'm reasonably sure that language is going to survive. Now, we're not going to mandate that a certain amount move on to the people's tax bills, but we're going to give the state the right to segue back and forth. So I think you're onto something, and I congratulate you.
That's interesting. Hey, we also had a couple questions that we talked about earlier that you may want to jump in on. One was gas costs that were so expensive this winter. There's a big debate over, you know, should we build another gas pipeline?
Yes.
Wouldn't that not help with costs? And also potentially, couldn't you also argue that it could potentially help with emissions? That sounds like counterintuitive, but if you have an energy bottleneck and then we're just, I don't know, using an oil plant, you know, power from an oil plant in New York or a coal plant, then you're not really getting anywhere. Gas is obviously a better alternative than that. Where do you stand on, you know, another pipeline, in the understanding that this is a long-term effort, right? We're not going to just flip a switch in 2030. Everybody's great and we're all, you know, happy and wonderful and we've made this huge transition. It's going to take decades, right? And if people are already rebelling about their tax bills, their energy bill,
Yeah, no, Scott, you're right.
What's going to happen? You know,
I'm not wild about gas pipelines because of the long-term costs. I mean, as a guy who has to think about what people are going to be paying for energy, well, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, as well as tomorrow, I want to be careful that I'm not loading costs onto the future. The trouble with the gas infrastructure, a pipeline in particular, is that the useful life of the asset is 30 years. And people are paying for that for 30 years. If you acknowledge that climate change is real and is going to exact its pound of flesh on all of us, and impose its own set of costs, you have to think about a future in which climate change is present too. So no, I think we're going to need natural gas for a very long time. But my strategy for supplying the gas would, in fact, include, first of all, maintaining our current fossil fuel, mostly gas facilities. You know, there are 89 fossil fuel plants in Massachusetts alone right now that supply our peak energy needs, Scott. So most of them must stay dormant, but they come alive on really hot days like we've had over the last 3. Otherwise, they kind of sit there unused. We have a strategy, and I got to give the Healy people a lot of credit for bringing down the peak, because a lot of the costs associated with paying for 30 years of new gas pipeline can be avoided if you can address the 100 hours out of the entire year where everything needs to be cranking. Right now, because we have the occasional very hot day. In the future, although it's way off, it's probably 12 years off, we'll have the day when everybody needs to be running their heat pumps and stay warm in the winter. You want to address those peaks, but if you think of it strategically, even the gas question really comes down to how are we going to supply energy when everybody needs it at once? I can tell you that is a fascinating problem, but a lot of smart people in Massachusetts have lots of solutions. And you're familiar, I know, with some of them. But for example, if you can invest in the house so that at the peak moments you need fewer therms to stay warm, or in wintertime you're going to need fewer electrons to keep your heat pump moving. If you can bring down the energy needs of the house, you're not going to need to build the new gas pipeline. Insofar as you do need gas, though, and let's assume again it's going to be around for a long time, I'm in favor of going with a liquefied natural gas as the stopgap. Why do LNG is very expensive, but why do I prefer to keep using the Everett Marine Terminal to import LNG? Because we can dispense with that infrastructure much more quickly than we can dispense with a gas pipeline, which we're going to be paying for forever. Do I want my constituents on the hook to pay for the next 30 years for a new stretch of gas? I do not, because I know that the world changes quickly, that we're going to be conjuring with climate change. When we need gas, I want to bring it in by import, because I can drop that import facility or effectively mothball it much more quickly than I can mothball a new gas line with a 30-year life. So I'm being very practical here, balancing today's costs. The cost was for 2030, but all those costs for 2040. And don't lock me in. Don't lock me in where I can't escape the cost of new gas infrastructure. Give me a little flexibility.
What the other thing we touched upon was
Can
Paul.
I just,
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was really worried that we wouldn't have some disagreements today, and I'm so happy that here's one. I just have to say, wait, the least expensive gas in the world is 100 or 200 miles from New England in Pennsylvania. And yes, getting it to us would require the construction of a long-lived gas pipeline. But the other side of a long-lived asset is that you can amortize the cost of that asset over many years. And so that the annual cost of the amortization, not to mention the gas savings themselves, in terms of the present value to our consumers and to our region, is, in my opinion, a better way to go than being reliant on a very uncertain international market. So I think Senator Barrett and I respectfully disagree on that point. I think we should run those numbers. I think we should. My concern, as I mentioned earlier, is that there's been almost a religious fervor about the idea that we don't want to expand gas capacity into the region, and likewise that we want to force residential customers and business customers not to use gas in their homes and businesses. When my hometown of Newton, passes a resolution prohibiting the use of gas in new structures and renovations, I'm really a bit stunned. I can't recall any time in history when a local government has told people which energy form they're allowed to use in their house or their business. We've, whether it was wood or coal or oil or gas or electricity in its day, you got to choose. The government is now saying, we will choose on your behalf. And maybe they'll make the right choice, but maybe, as has often been the case, and as I was saying before, I've often been the participant in this or the instigator for this, we've often made the wrong choice that has actually ended up harming folks, or, this is the point Mike Monahan was making before, or aggravating income distributional problems, putting higher proportional costs on those less able to pay. And I guess all I'm saying is I would hope when the legislature and the governor and the DPU and everybody look at these issues, that they weigh those balances carefully, that we don't approach this as saying, because of climate change, we have to reach a certain result, irrespective of the cost to the region and to the competitiveness of our region, that we should consider those things. And whatever we decide is fine, but let's make sure we've looked at it in a really rigorous and as objective a way as possible.
Paul,
Thanks,
Mike, it sounds
me
like you have
now,
a couple
Scott.
things.
I couldn't agree with Paul more on this issue. Tuesday, 6% of it, more electricity was coming from oil and coal than from wind and solar on Tuesday. We need more gas. And what's ironic with Paul, if you wanted to boil a pot of water, the same amount of water, I put a gas stove and electric stove, the electric stove uses more gas generating the electricity to boil the water than the natural gas does. So one step forward, 3 steps backwards. It's they don't realize that, yeah, my electric stove is burning more gas than if I just kept my gas stove.
Yeah,
Well, let me, if I could, Scott, you tell me if I'd like to offer a rejoinder, but I won't if you would like to jump to another issue.
yeah, no, go ahead. I think it's a really good subject. So jump in.
Yeah. Well, let me say, I remember Paul's brilliant service as head of the Mass Water and the MWRA, the Mass Water and Sewer Authority. Do I have the
Mass Water Resources?
Yeah. What I remember, Paul, from that era, of course, is that the cities and towns and the state of Massachusetts did not give people choices with respect to water and sewer. We defined entire areas as the proper jurisdiction for sewerage systems and for water delivery. We did not let individual homes opt out and stay on wells or refuse to or to stay on septic systems. We are not in the habit of giving individual property owners in Newton the option to decide whether to be a part of the MWRA district. That's not the way democracy works. Quite the contrary, with respect to water and sewer and with respect to, I would wager, electricity and gas, we make decisions in a democratic way. There have to be votes, and then we gently and politely impose our will on the individual holdouts in the name of serving the greater common good. The other thing I want to say is that we don't want to conflate current homeowners in Newton with new construction. Those are apples and oranges issues. Nobody is telling current homeowners in Newton that they have to get off their gas. What we've said with respect to new construction, because retrofitting houses is very expensive. And once your house was built with gas, it's an iffy question as to whether one should move off it. And certainly we don't make you. But new construction, the math is totally different. In new construction, where you're putting in the HVA system for the first time, The consulting reports run by the Baker administration, not by a Democrat, but by a Republican administration, show that it was less expensive to build a house in Newton using heat pumps than using gas or oil. Now, the margin with gas was small, the margin with oil was great. Well, I mean, the consulting studies exist, Mike. You can't
Yeah, but
dispute the
I'm an
existence of the
electrician. I
studies.
know what
You
I
can
know what
dispute the studies,
electricity.
but the point
Electric
is,
heat?
we studied the issue before making the decision. We
Electric
studied
heat?
it first. The numbers penciled out, and then we decide. And by the way, I don't need to tell you, I don't need to tell Mike, but there's a lot of work for his union members in heat pumps. A lot of his rank and file members would agree with me that we need to electrify for climate reasons and job creation reasons both. Staying with gas doesn't help the membership of the IBEW. Let me tell you that.
Sure it
So
does.
what we have to do is to take note of the fact that new construction is different. And we also need to take note, Paul, that it wasn't your local government that ordained that with respect to new construction, you would be using heat pumps. That was the state legislature, which gave 10 communities the option to opt in and decide if they wish to be among the 10. And I'll tell you this, because I'm a numbers guy. When I wrote, and it so happened that I did write the language, when I wrote the language letting 10 communities opt in to all electric with regard to new construction only, I made sure that we did rigorous data gathering. We're going to know whether that consultant study, which shows that new construction with a heat pump costs less than new construction with gas, we're going to know whether that was accurate, because I made sure that the numbers are cranking out there to tell us, and that will inform our future decision making. So all of this is taking place in a non-ideological fashion. The reason 10 communities can opt into going all electric with new construction is because I believe in piloting. I believe in doing what the private sector does. What the private sector does is it tests a new product in a limited market before going nationwide or worldwide. We are testing the proposition about whether we can save money going all electric and new construction in 10 communities out of the 351 in the States. The folks who are anti-entrepreneurial and anti-innovation are the ones who argue that not even with respect to 10 communities should we be piloting a new technology, which of course on its face is an indefensible position, although some of my friends love to maintain it.
A clarification, Senator, the IBEW represents gas workers. We have 40,000 members.
All right, so thank you for servicing your bias. I didn't realize that.
And Eversource and National Grid gas workers are members of the IBEW. That fellow that got killed last year by the car, he was a member of the IBEW on the road.
Gotcha. Thank you, Mike.
These are and I know I'd love to go on all day, but we've got to wrap it up here in a couple minutes. And some really great discussion. So I appreciate everybody. But jumping in on this, and it may be a little late to get into this, but offshore wind, have we put too many of our eggs in that basket? And is it even realistic to think we're going to get more than one of these facilities in the next 5 or 10 years? I mean, we have one, right? And it's got one turbine spinning, and it seems like even before Trump came along, and Trump obviously hates offshore wind. The industry was already facing it. I mean, the business press writes about this, and it's like this inside joke, like wind is always the thing that's going to be, the new thing that's going to be happening in 5 years. And it's always 5 years away or 10 years away. And it seems like we have a lot at stake here on something that may not work out.
Well, I'll make a friendly bet with you, Scott. And again, this means good jobs for Mike's union members.
Europeans, Senator, the majority of people working offshore wind are Europeans.
Fair enough, but there are folks working onshore in New Bedford in the provisioning and in the staging areas, but a lot of them are members of the laborers union, it's true, and iron workers, but some of them are members of yours. But Scott, we're going to have 800 megawatts from Vineyard Wind 1 cranking 12 months from today. And you're right, the deadlines have been pushed off and pushed off and pushed off again. Trump hates offshore wind, and in his first term, he delayed deployment of offshore wind, and now he's bedeviling us again. But that is real energy. And by the way, it costs a lot. It's good energy per megawatt. So we're going to have 800 megawatts we do have a shot. We do have a shot at getting a New England Wind one, a second 800 megawatt operation. Also launched, all the federal permits are in. It's been rebid by the state. Because all the federal permitting is done, we have an opportunity maybe to convince Trump's DOE that one ought to go forward. You know, I want to mention that we've got 1,200 megawatts coming down through the state of Maine, hydro generated by Hydro-Quebec. So you have 1,200 megawatts coming down despite the Maine state referendum, which temporarily slowed it down. You've got 800 megawatts coming from this first wind project with a second project by the same company, by the way, so they know what they're doing, Avangrid, a second project possibly. By the time Trump leaves office, which you know, is a mere 3.5 years from today, it's a blink of an eye. A blink of an eye, and we'll be in the post-Trump era. Blink in terms of energy planning, I mean, it's a nothing burger. He'll be gone. Offshore wind will be back, I suspect. It's true, we're going to lose a lot of initiative here. The offshore wind, by the way, is going to outrank gas and oil easily worldwide. Many more solar megawatts, many more offshore wind megawatts in every place other than the US. China is going to steal our thunder. They already dominate, as we know, so much having to do with EVs. And now they're going to own the offshore wind business. Trump is not a business guy. He's actually an ideologue. If he were a business guy, he really would believe in all of the above. He'd let all the alternatives, fossil fuel and clean, flourish. He wouldn't put his thumb on the scale against offshore wind. The problem is that he's a hater in this respect, unfortunately. This is a question where he's indulging his peak instead of being a rational business guy who asks the question, damn, let's let that gas pipeline get built insofar as I control multi-state permitting, but let's let that offshore wind project get built too, and let them compete. Let them compete. Clean energy is willing to compete with oil, gas, and coal, and Trump won't let us compete. He's anti-competition.
So, Scott,
I'm going to do like a lightning round here of final thoughts. You want to jump in, Paul, or?
I'm not going to disagree with the characterization about the president, but I just am going to say that there were big problems in the wind field before Trump took his actions, and right now, as I understand it, we had something like 8 gigawatts worth of wind on the horizon for us. It looks like about 2 gigawatts now resulting, and that things have been pushed off for a long time. I hope Senator Barrett is right and that it recovers more quickly. I did want to mention, my understanding is that in New York State, that the pause on the wind projects that the president was pushing there have been traded with the governor of New York in exchange for releasing permission on a gas pipeline through New York State. So if our goal here is to let 1,000 blossoms bloom, maybe there's an example of where it can happen.
Connecticut
Rhode Island
will definitely benefit from that.
I'm sorry, Mike, what were you saying? I interrupted.
Connecticut and Rhode Island will benefit from that. If there was a quid pro quo, she's not admitting to it. But Massachusetts, I'm not sure you and your fellow legislators will go along with additional pipeline coming into the state of Mass. But at least Rhode Island, Connecticut, they're not opposed. So there could be additional generation due to that if there was a quid pro quo. You know?
Well, as I say, I anticipate gas being a part of the mix, but I don't want to commit to 30 years of gas, given the real realities of climate change. 30 years of new gas, I'm not talking about the current stuff, which is going to continue, but 30 years of new gas is a bad bet.
You got to realize wind is only 50% capacity. So an 800 megawatt RFP or whatever you want to call it, it's really, you're only getting 400 megawatts because it's only 50% productive.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody taking the time here. We could go on all day. This is fascinating. And I really appreciate it. Everybody's brought a different perspective, which is great, right? Because this is such a complex issue. I mean, I had like 12 questions. I knew I wouldn't get through more than 3, and that's probably what happened. So So thank you all again for joining and for everybody listening. And Mike, what would you like to?
One last thing, I wish we got to Commonwealth Fusion. That is an embarrassment to our state, to our legislators. When Commonwealth Fusion, an MIT-born company, decides to do their first project in Virginia, that's an embarrassment.
Yeah. So yeah, that's another big one. It's in the whole issue of, and maybe that's another show another time, nuclear fusion. And yeah, and that's something we wrote about where they've gone to Virginia to do their first plant. But well, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you everybody for who logged in, and hope to see you here again for our next podcast, next forum.